Okay, this is an old S&T issue, the Crusades. Surprisingly large number of thumbs on this one, like 57 plus some gate gold. So I figured it's been on my mind a little bit recently, knowing that value, or knowing that it was highly ranked. Decided I'm going to do this as my current break between flying color scenarios, maybe permanent end of flying color scenarios, we'll see. Okay. This game covers only 2 Crusades, unlike, what did we cover before? We covered Kingdom of Heaven down here. There it is. And we also have Onward Christian Soldiers, which I think covers more as well. Kingdom of Heaven covers most of the Crusades, actually. At least the ones that go into Palestine. And some that don't. The Egyptian ones as well, I think, are in there. This, though, only worries about 2 of the bigger, more famous Crusades. The First Crusade, which is going to be represented as a big multiplayer game. And in a sense, Onward Christian Soldiers appears to be the direct descendant of this game. Although it definitely doesn't have the same rules. But it's kind of like what Richard Berg thought he should have done after having, let this stew on his mind for a couple decades. So this one handles the First Crusade as a big multiplayer game, and then it handles a 2-player game as the Third Crusade. And the initial decision on this had been to go with multiple Crusades, a bigger amount of territory, including all of Asia Minor, but it ended up slated for a magazine game, and thus didn't have as much room or as many counters as it could. A few interesting concepts here that I want to quickly run through. So I'm going to go through the rules for the First Crusade. They're more extensive. The Third Crusade is almost a subset of, there is some, obviously, setup and stuff like that, but there is some additional stuff in the Third Crusade that's a little different. But for the most part, I'll just tell you what you trim away as you go. And one of the things you trim away is, well, 5 of the players. Okay. So one of the things is, let's take a look at counters here. They have 2 numbers on them, and they also have this band. The band indicates the rank of the character. And you'll see those boxes over there represent these main characters here. So you have like Bohemond and Raymond, Robert, Count of Flanders, and that's Godfrey of Bouillon, the perfect knight or whatever at the time. Now, the second rank will be here, like Eustace here, and then third rank will be these guys here. Some of the characters are bishops, like this fella here, Adhemar. And he's got a cross on him. You could say, well, what does that matter? It matters when there are visions involved. You're allowed to dispute visions using bishops. And that's sort of their only real difference in the game. You also have a couple of numbers on each character. And so the Muslim players, you've got the 4 different Crusader players: Germans, Sicilian Franks, Southern Franks, and Northern Normans and Franks. For the Muslim players, you have the Egyptian Fatimids, the Syrians, who could be split into 2 powers to make an 8-player game if you like, but they suggest not doing that. And finally, the Mosul Turks, who are, well, this is them. They look almost like the Syrians, but you can see there actually is a little difference. There are also some non-player powers. Armenians here, and the Byzantines, who are stacked in here, and they'll be able to help the Crusaders for a while until they decide to leave. Okay, so the numbers on a character are, the first number is the guile rating. Now that's going to affect a number of things, but the biggest thing it affects is treachery and disputation of visions. It also, though, helps determine who's going to lead a force if there's any disagreement on that. The second number is the combat rating. And now the guile rating will go away in the Third Crusade game. Okay. The map itself has a number of different features to it, not too much. It's got these mountain ranges that are impassable, little rivers, obviously some water. 3 different terrain types, yellow, kind of tan, and green. That's going to determine how forageable the terrain is, rather than how rough it is. I think I had mentioned a few times that there were no movement points in this game. I lied about that. I think in Onward Christian Soldiers there may be none in the Ancient World games, but Berg hadn't quite gotten to that extreme in this. Each unit essentially does have a movement point cost, but you don't end up moving necessarily based on how many movement points you have available. Anyway, we'll touch that in a bit. Because as you move, you're going to accumulate attrition points from the different terrain types. I don't know if I have that written down somewhere useful here. I do not. I'll have to look at that when we get the movement rolls. So I'll wait on that for now. You also have little cities, and there are different kinds of cities. This is a level 1 city. It doesn't have any little breaks in it, whereas this one has 2 breaks in it, so that makes it a level 2 city. Level 3 is going to have 3 little breaks in it. Let's see if we can find one. That's not it. Antioch's level 4. It has 4 breaks in it. Maybe Hama? Hama has 3. And that's going to affect their defensive strength as well as how much you can have stacked in it. You see the stacking limits are listed here. You have some little ports, and I think that's about it. Okay. I also have, for the Muslims and the Byzantines and Armenians, there are these strength point markers, which are going to be the number of strength points that a leader can haul around with him. The Christians don't use that, though. What the Christians are going to be using is one of these charts. Each leader has his own force, number of strength points equal to the number of boxes in his force. That's also important, so as they lose troops, you can mark them off on there. But it's also important that you keep track of leaders on paper, and there's going to be other stuff you keep track of on paper as well. Because each leader's guile rating can change as the game goes through. And let's see, you also have these treasuries, which have to be recorded on paper. There are treasuries also inside every city, which will have to be recorded on paper. So there's a bit of bookkeeping in this game. In the First Crusade. A lot less in the Third Crusade. No Second Crusade for this. Sequence of play is pretty simple. Only this big. The first thing you do is a diplomacy phase. Everybody gets to talk to each other and make friends. Then you write down orders for your units. And after you do that, you go to a random events phase where there may be a random event for the turn. There will not be one in the first turn. Then from your orders, you announce any bribes that are undertaken, and those will be resolved. Then your units will move according to your written orders, and they could end up being prevented in their movement by moving through forces that are set to defend or block them. Then you go to a combat phase if you're in the same hex, and you'll see the cities are kind of little squares within the hexes. There's kind of a weird dichotomy around that we have to discuss at some point. After any combat is handled, then we go to a siege phase, and then an economics phase where you collect income from your cities that you own, and caravans if they come in. Okay. Very simple, limited number of orders here. Move. You have to write down the entire path of the force that's moving and the composition of the force. This is important for the Crusader player because he's got kind of a cheat available, which I have to figure out how I handled this before. But essentially he can move his entire stack through the terrain as he likes. Or he can split them up so that each leader is essentially moving his own little path. My rule with this was, if you start in the same place and end in the same place, you have to go to the city, you have to travel together. But that doesn't really work. That's going to cause too high an attrition on the Crusader player, so I'm beginning to loosen that and go more towards the base rules. But the problem is, I don't want one leader moving this way, one leader moving this way, one leader moving this way, you know. So essentially, I want to make sure that that spread out doesn't mean I just take as many paths as I can possibly. Each possibly discrete path is a safe new way to travel. Because here's the problem. Every unit that you have affects your attrition, and we'll hit on that in a moment. But you can also move outside a city and attack it. And essentially that says, well, I'm going to move in outside this city, and then I'm going to lay siege to it. You can have a defend order. A defend order says, I'm going to sit here, and if anybody moves through my hex, I can block them at my option. If you don't have a defend order and you're not in a city, you can't prevent another person's movement through your hex. You're probably moving too. You can blockade hexes with a fleet. You can do a full or partial siege. That's if you're already sitting outside the city. That allows you to actually do the assault on the city. A full siege, all your force is directed inside to the city itself, so you'll get a full assault value, but you're halved if you're attacked from outside that hex. If you do a partial siege, you have full defensive strength, but you only have half strength if you choose to do a siege assault. In either case, if the defender sorties out, you have full strength against them. Okay, movement. You're going to have, there is a movement allowance for units. I believe Crusaders have a movement allowance of 5, and Muslims have an allowance of 6. But as you're moving, you accumulate attrition points, which are going to be compared. The total number of attrition points here on this line will be compared to the strength of the force that's moving, and then you'll get an amount of attrition, which is strength points you have to lose. And you just take them off. Now, in this game, but there's no money in the Third Crusade, for 5 Byzants each, that's the units of money, you're able to spend and prevent 1 attrition point. Okay, so this is why the Crusader paths become important. If I'm allowed to define as many discrete paths as I possibly can, I can pretty much move my entire force without ever taking attrition as long as there's no enemy near me. On the other hand, for the Muslims, I can't do that. Because the Muslims don't have stacks and stacks of leaders. They have 1 or 2 leaders in a hex. And they have fair-sized forces that are going to take more attrition. That's unreasonable. Yes, the game gives a benefit to the Muslims, giving them a better column for the attrition, but that's intended because they're more familiar with the terrain. And I got to kind of feel myself out to try to figure out how I want to handle this, because I don't think what I did before, which is just, hey, start in the same location, end in the same location. You are a force that's moving together. I don't care how you could split up. I don't think that's exactly fair, because Crusader attrition ended up really, really devastating, so they had to move really slowly because of that. Slower than they did historically. So I'm going to try to figure out if I can find a middle ground there. Okay. Costs a movement point to enter a city. You enter the hex, and then another movement point to actually enter the city. There's impassable terrain. The mountains are impassable. Rivers are impassable when it's flooding, when it's raining. There's no real stacking limit except inside cities. We went over the numbers there. Okay. there's zones of influence. Let's talk about these a little bit. It's been a while since I played this, but I skimmed the rules a bit. The only things that can exert a zone of influence are forces. A force is defined as a leader and some troops. A force of any size inside a level 2 or bigger city or any castle. There are no castles in this scenario. They're from the Third Crusade. Will exert a zone of influence in its own hex and in every adjacent hex. Now, a force of 5 army strength points or more with a defend order has a zone of influence in its own hex. A force of any size in a level 1 city has a zone of influence in the hex that it's in. These don't go through any impassable terrain, water, whatever. You cannot trace a line of communication through an enemy zone of influence, and your force must stop when entering an enemy zone of influence. However, there's a restriction or an exception to this, which is if you're moving to go siege a city, you don't have to stop entering its zone of influence. You can keep going in. There's something that's not specified here, but I kind of insist on, which is if you're sieging a city, you cancel out its zone of influence. I don't see any rule on that. Maybe I'm missing it, but otherwise, multiple zones of influence by 2 different stacks, enemy stacks, can both exist in the same place, even in the hex that they're both sitting in. You need leaders in order to move. The highest ranking leader, i.e. a solid stripe, if there is one, or one that's got 1 break, or one that's got 2 breaks, those are the 3 levels of leaders. The highest ranking leader will be in command automatically. There's no way around that. But if there's multiple leaders of the same rank, they can agree who's in charge, as long as they're allied. If can't come to an agreement, what they do is, I believe they roll a die and add their guile, and one person's in charge. When you actually fight, you're going to go on the combat table here. Let's see if I can remember this. Okay, so here's the land combat results table. The attacker is going to be the guy with the higher combat ability, the leader who's got the better combat ability. Now, the defender has an advantage in combat, so there's this weird sort of, do you want to have your highest combat ranked leader there because he might actually cost you? There's a lot of variation in the odds table, and it's rounded in favor of the defender. But it's not simply a die roll on here. There's one other factor here, which is the formation. You roll a die based on the combat rating of the leader to come up with a formation, and both sides do this. And then you compare the formations, and this is the modifier in column shifts in favor of the Crusader player. If for some reason Crusaders are fighting Crusaders or Muslims are fighting Muslims, you simply compare the combat ratings, and that becomes the modifier straight up. You don't have this extra little random step in there. Then what you're going to do is you're going to roll a die on the table, and the number there is the percentage that person loses. So let's say we're on the 1.5 to 1 and we roll a 4 here. The attacker would lose 10%, the defender would lose 20% of his own force and get a retreat result for the defender. The retreater loses the battle. Okay. After combat results are taken, after you mark off your losses. Now for the Muslims, that's just losing strength points off the marker, but for the Crusader, he has to scratch off little boxes on here. This is important because then the commander gets to, one at a time, for both sides, gets to one at a time go to the, here's the hex attrition value. Here's the amount of attrition that you're going to pay for each type of hex that you move into. One at a time, he rolls on this table for each leader. If the Muslims lose a single leader, they stop rolling. If the Crusaders lose 2 leaders, they get to stop rolling. So here's the tricky thing. The first leader you roll for has sort of the greatest chance of being lost, well, the first 2 for the Crusaders. Because, you know, so the order of how you roll for them kind of affects the odds of that person getting killed, and that's under the control of the commander. The commander has some interesting choices there. He could try to screw somebody over by going after one of their powerful and high-ranking leaders who has lots and lots of troops and make him roll early. Of course, you know, that's a way to piss somebody off without much chance of doing anything, so that may not be a wise idea. It also will weaken the overall Crusader force to make that kind of play. For the Muslim player, chances are they're not going to be working too much together, but the Crusaders actually will. Much more, I think. We'll see how it plays out. Okay. If you have a 10-to-1 odds or better or worse, or however you want to do it, there's an overrun. The smaller force is eliminated, and you don't have to worry about checking leaders or whatever. They're all going to be captured. Any treasury is taken fully intact after the battle. Okay. If you siege a city, there's 2 factors here. To maintain a siege, you have to have a number of forces starting outside the city with at least as many army strength points as the defender has inside the city. Now, for the actual assault, though, you're going to be multiplying the defender's value by the level of the city. Okay, so a level 1 city doesn't give you any multiplier, but a level 4 multiplies the troops inside of it by 4. And the attacker is going to be multiplied perhaps by a half if he's only doing a partial siege. After those modifications, he has to have at least 3-to-1 odds to conduct a siege. And then he'll be rolling here on the siege assault table to see whether or not he gets a successful siege. If he does, he captures the entirety of the enemy's leaders and destroys all his troops, captures his treasury. There's an exception to that if he captures it not through military means, but through treachery. Up to 10 Byzants escape with a leader, an enemy leader. Okay. Lines of communications. And after siege, if the siege is still there, if you didn't succeed in taking it, you take siege attrition. Well, you'd be going on the siege attrition table, which is over here. The level of the hex is going to be what you roll against, or if you're inside the city. But if you get an asterisk, next turn you're going to be rolling on a worse level of hex. So this is a fertile hex, this will be a mixed hex, and this will be a desert type hex. Lines of communication, you have to trace these in order to have your supply line. This is a path of any length going back to a supply source. You can't trace it through impassable terrain. For the Saracens, it has to, okay, that's Third Crusade, it has to go back to one of a set of cities. For the Crusaders, the supply source is a friendly port or where the Crusaders start back here, which is really the edge of Byzantine territory there. You can't trace through terrain that's interdicted by enemy troops. Remember, the interdiction requires that they either be defending or in a city with the appropriate force. Okay. So let's... Okay, a Crusader line of communication can't be traced through more than 2 consecutive barren hex sides, these yellow ones, and a Muslim line cannot go through more than 3 of those. I believe the Muslims have to trace back to any city that they own which has a treasury in it. A treasury is going to be defined as at least 10 Byzants stored in that city. You can store Byzants in a city without there being a treasury. It's just not called one, and you can't spend those Byzants. If you're in a city or castle, you don't need to trace. If you can't trace it, if you're Crusaders and you start your movement phase without a line, you're going to be rolling on the 19 plus, which is the worst line of the attrition chart. And that doesn't matter whether you move or how far you move. If the Muslims start without a line of communication, they can only move 2 hexes in a game turn, 1 if it's a rain turn. And they will lose a guaranteed strength point in addition to any losses they take from the attrition table. There are going to be navies in this game. Maybe. They come in through random events for the most part, although the Fatimids start with a few. I don't know if they get more in this scenario from the random events. I haven't studied the random events at all. I like to be surprised by things, right? So fleets more or less can only travel from port to port, but there are some exceptions. If they're landing a naval invasion, they can stick around where they are. If they are attacking an enemy, they can stick around where they are. Or if they're blockading an enemy port, they can stick around outside of their own port. Combat's going to be a total of naval strength points. As a differential, the attacker's the guy with the bigger force. See if I got naval combat here somewhere. There should be one. There it is. So it's going to be a differential between the size of the force and strength points. But if one side has 2-to-1 odds or better, he gets a +1. And if he has 3-to-1 odds or better, he gets a +2 to his total strength. And then the results will be represented as a percentage of the enemy lost. Each 2-point strength can transport up to 10 army strength points. Each 1-point fleet up to 5. Fleet transports its own order. Now, you can transport to any coastal hex you like, but it may not work well unless it's one of the following cities. Acre, Famagusta, Alexandria, Damietta is down there too, and Pelusium is down there. Any other city that you try to land in, first of all, on a 5 or a 6, you lose 10% of your force, or if you do it coastally. On a 5 or a 6, you're going to lose 10% of your force. And you just can't do it in the winter. If you attack a coastal hex where an enemy troop is, and you get a retreat result, you have to retreat back onto your ships. It doesn't say what happens if your ships leave after they drop you off. I would say just don't do that. Weather. Starting in November and through the winter, the Crusader's going to be rolling for each of his fleets. On a 1, 2, or 3, the fleet comes off the game and it'll come back in springtime at either Adalia or Famagusta. And it has no effect on blockade or combat other than as discussed above. Rain. November and March 1 are going to be rain game turns. The Muslims and Saracens have a movement allowance of 3. All other units have a 2. No one can cross rivers during a rain turn. Line of communication can't go over. December, January, and February are winter game turns. Movement allowances are normal, but attrition points are doubled. And if you move during the winter, you have to lose at least 1 strength point. If you don't move and you're not inside a city or castle, you lose an army strength point per game turn. Oh, that's something I forgot in attrition. If you don't move for a while, you start taking attrition for not moving. I think if it's 2 full game turns you haven't moved, you start taking attrition. If you're in a city or castle, though, you're immune to attrition. And winter will not affect any of the fertile hexes or the cities in Egypt. There's a set of random events for each crusade. The Third Crusade has its own little set and its own neutrals and its own deployment, and I'll go over them and the victory conditions if I play them. But the First Crusade's got a little bit different. First of all, it has these economics rules, where we're going to have these field treasuries, which armies can haul around. And remember, they can use the cash from that, it's got to come from their field treasury, in order to buy off losses from attrition. They may also be able to assign bribes. Basically, you need your leader present to pay a bribe. And that can either be a bribe to Armenians or to another player to, be part of your negotiation. You get income by having a force or any army strength points in a level 2, 3, or 4 city, and you'll get that many bucks of income. Income can also come from random events, and the money appears in the city where it came from. That can go in a field treasury, or it could go in the city treasury, or it can go in the city not quite in a treasury, but once it gathers enough, you'll have that. You can bribe people to do whatever you like, but the bribes have to be written down, and there's no guarantee that the person's going to do what you bought them to do. If the Fatimid player moves his fleets to any hex other than a Fatimid-controlled port, he has to pay 5 bezants per fleet. Bunch of random events again, including visions, which, as I said, they can be disputed. The guile rating. Okay. If you don't know who the leader can be, you roll a die plus your guile rating, and that's who gets to lead the forces out of people with equal command level. When you do the siege, if you have a leader with unparenthesized guile, some of the bishops are parenthesized, and you have at least 1 treachery point present, you can write down in your orders that you will be using treachery instead of a normal siege. The defender also, if he has guile and treachery points available in his city, actually if he has treachery points available in the commander of the city, he can also write defensive treachery points. That's going to be risky, but if you know you're going to be facing treachery, you might do this. If you cancel out your opponent's aggressive treachery, his treachery fails, and he's not going to get a siege assault or a treachery roll that time. Otherwise, what happens? The person doing the treachery rolls a die, and he's got to get under his guile plus his treachery. I think a 6 always fails. I don't remember. If the defender loses a city to treachery, everything's captured except for 1 leader, 1 strength point, and up to 10 bezants. And that runs away to the nearest city. Okay, your guile changes, and that's a reason why, again, we need bookkeeping here. If you win a victorious land battle, forcing the enemy to retreat, you get a point, unless it's Armenians. If you take a city by siege, assault, treachery, or surrender, oh, I forgot to mention that. Anytime you want to siege assault a city, the defender has the right to surrender. And then you get to negotiate with them what the terms might be. You don't have to accept it. Or if you capture the true cross, which is, of course, in Jerusalem, the Muslims can't do anything with it, but the Christians can pick it up. If you do that, you end up getting a point of guile added to your initial guile. You lose them if you fail to take a city by treachery, if you fail to assassinate, if you fail when you dispute a vision, if you take Deus Vult number 12 as an event, which is, I think, the Byzantines go home, but it may have other effects. Or if you voluntarily withdraw from combat. Your guile can never go above 6 nor lower than 1 unless it started out as 0, in which case it's not going to move. All right. A few other little things here. The Byzantines, Budamides. I got him. Shit. Sorry about that. I got him there. He's got 5 strength points of siege troops. Each player, whoever has the highest total guile rating plus die roll controls Buddhamids at the beginning of the game. He'll change allegiance if 2 players agree to swap him. If the player for that turn, the commander for that turn, loses a guile, everyone else gets to roll for him. Or as per the Emperor's Oath. He'll go home when Deus Vult 12 happens. He can't lose strength points until every other Crusader leader in the Hex loses one. And he gives you a 1-column shift on siege assaults in your favor. Now, because the Crusaders all promised Alexius that they would give him all the territory they took, anytime you take a level 2 city or above as a Crusader, you can pledge it to the Emperor. And at that point, you get Buddhamids. You get to keep collecting taxes for the city, but the city will no longer count as yours for victory points. However, once Deus Vult 12 happens, it goes back under your control. If multiple people pledge in the same turn, the highest guile rating plus a die roll out of them gets Buddhamids. If the Muslims move north of Cyprus and west of Hex 1400, which is going to be around here-ish, a huge Byzantine army, 50 strength points, 100 Byzants, Emperor Alexius, and General Taticus comes in where the Crusaders start up there, and it'll stay on the board until it chases the Muslims away. However, if Deus Vult number 12 has come out or comes out, the Byzantines leave. We got a bunch of Armenians on the board. They're kind of iffy little forces. The biggest ones are 5 strength points. But you can bid for them. During the orders writing phase, you write down bids for them. When the bribes are revealed, you might end up getting one. If you gave the highest bribe to a particular Armenian, you get that Armenian. All bribes are expended. If 2 high bribes are both made, the Armenian takes them both and stays what he's doing. If you own one from a bribe, someone else can bribe him away on your next turn. So you got to keep paying him or else convince people not to bribe him. Now those bribes aren't just Christians. The Muslims are involved in the bribery too there. So there's kind of everybody's got some interest in the Armenians. Some of them, especially Edessa, are worthwhile with the, what is that, a level 4 city? No, level 3. Still, that's $3 a turn, so that's well worth having. You can attack your own faith. You can ally with the enemy faith and work with them. There's a dissension effect. When there's dissension, if your force is attacking and one of the players has dissension, that player's forces can't attack. He has to withdraw along lines of retreat. And if he can't do that, he actually hurts the combat shift, although he is counted in. Alternatively, players who don't have dissension can choose to withdraw from combat. They roll a die. If they roll lower than the guile, they succeed in withdrawing, but they lose a guile point. If they fail, they have to stay and fight, but it affects things as though it's dissension. Okay. Each of the most of the setup I have in place, you have the Fatimids stretch up to here and over here, the Syrians in the middle here, and then the Muscles here, but they have forces off map that'll be coming in 1098, the second year of the game. Whew. All the Crusaders start where they are, and they have piles of money, up to 150 Byzants for the Normans. On the first turn of the game, the Christians will have 10 movement points, but they're going to take full attrition for those. So it just allows them more room to spread out, but they can take more damage from it. They give rules for different numbers of players, and you don't want to play this in less than 4. Okay, victory points. Each city has different victory point totals. So for example, Jerusalem's worth 25 to the Christians and 10 to the Muslims, Antioch 15 to the Christians, etc. down the line. All right, the True Cross is worth 5 points to the Crusader who has it at the end of the game. Now, most of the Muslim players, the Syrians and the Fatimids, and there could be 2 Syrian players, score points just by owning cities of these values. Kerboga, that's the Muscles, has his own special rules. He has to pick 6 cities from here, up to 6. And these are the victory points he'll get if he controls the cities that he picks. He is not penalized if he doesn't have them, I believe. For the Crusaders, they determine what their victory conditions are secretly once Antioch falls over here. Once they take Antioch, or if it's the January 1099 turn, January in the last year, the Crusader player has to each Crusader player has to secretly choose 8 cities. These are his victory conditions. He'll use these victory points for them, and if he owns those cities alone, by himself, whatever, he'll get the points for them. On March 2nd, second turn of March, 1099, each Crusader player reveals his list of conditions secretly to other Crusader players. If no one bothered to take Jerusalem, then everyone gets it for free. However, if anyone took it, anyone who didn't takes a desertion effect. 20% of their force, rounded up, goes to the people who are going for Jerusalem. Hey, that's the goal here, guys. At the end of the game, the Crusaders lose 1 point for each city that they picked that they don't hold. And the player with the most points is going to win the game. And that's all there is. Balance? Shit, I don't know. I mean, look, the 8-player games has split the Syrians in half, but it doesn't do anything with their victory points. Some of the other games mix and match powers. It's up to you to balance it yourself, is basically what I see it as. If you think somebody's doing well, if you think the Syrians are doing well because they're so big, well, it's time for the Muslims to gang up on the Syrians, I guess. That's the only way I can see it. All right, we're not going to actually start playing tonight because it's late as hell, but I'm going to load this one up.